As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
This series is the story of Australian politics from the time the ancients first guessed the existence of a southern continent to the present day. Episode 1, Terra Australis. This first episode tells the story of an ancient fable of towering significance to modern Australia. It's not just that Australia's name is an obvious byproduct, but as we'll see, belief in Terra Australis shielded Australia from earlier European settlement, which left open an opportunity in the 18th century for a latecomer to the Asia-Pacific, Great Britain. So let's rewind a few millennia. The political history of Australia begins with a joint venture between some Phoenician sailors and an ambitious Egyptian pharaoh. Based in modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians were a significant but atypical power in the Mediterranean world from around 1200 BC to around 300 BC. Phoenician greatness was the result not of conquest, but of commerce. They were the ancient middlemen. Phoenicians established bustling trade colonies all across the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and even faraway Britain. All these endless transactions across the sea required a lot of detailed contracts, and that incentivised the rise of a sophisticated alphabet that, by and large, we use today. But the Phoenicians were too busy doing business to have left us significant literature. Their contemporaries, including Homer and Herodotus, however, described the Phoenicians as the finest mariners of antiquity. So what's all this got to do with Australia? Well, in around 600 BC, Egypt had a powerful pharaoh, Necho II, who gets a few mentions in the Bible. Necho had a somewhat imperialistic outlook, wanting to expand Egypt's reach. In this vein, Necho commissioned a fleet of Phoenician sailors to explore the unknown. Departing from the Red Sea, where northeast Africa meets the Middle East, these Phoenicians sailed down the east coast of Africa, going past modern-day Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Now, others had surely ventured in this direction, but these intrepid Phoenicians sailed on until they came to the bottom tip of that continent, what we know as South Africa. They could have returned home at that point via the way they'd come, but they pushed on even further into the unknown. They followed the coastline, which now took them north and up the west coast of Africa. They followed that all the way around, then they entered the Mediterranean Sea through the Straits of Gibraltar and then back to Egypt to unpack all they had learned. They'd been away for almost 3 years. Now, it's pretty likely that the pharaoh and others thought that they'd been lost at sea. Almost certainly, it was the first circumnavigation of Africa, and almost certainly the last for 2 millennia. These heroic Phoenician sailors must have had endless tales to tell at the welcome home party in Pharaoh's palace. Exotic customs, natural wonders, strange animals. But for some, the most intriguing report was that the position of the sun changed as they went further south. This curious intel spread. Soon it found its way into the possession of the Greeks, who were just entering their golden age of intellectual achievement. Smart minds began pondering, now why would the sun's position change in the south? There are few hard facts when dealing with ancient history, but our best guess is that it was the Greeks who were the first to think that, perhaps this flat-looking world of ours might actually be a big round ball. The earliest records we have of the Greeks speculating about a spherical world appear very soon after the circumnavigation of Africa. It's quite likely that the Phoenician intel about the sun's changing position triggered the curiosity about the shape of our world. The round world theory was passed along, and soon Babylonians, Indians, and Chinese astronomers concurred. There had been earlier hints, such as that during a lunar eclipse, we can see the shadow of the Earth on the moon, and that shadow is curved. Others had noticed that when a ship sailed to the horizon, the hull of the ship disappeared first. Had the world been flat, the top and the bottom of the boat would equally fade from view. So, well done, ancients. Yes, the world is round. But a byproduct of this profound insight was a profound fable, but a fable of huge consequence to modern Australia. Via accounts from traders and rudimentary maps, the Greeks understood that Eurasia was massive and that it was entirely in the northern hemisphere, as was most of Africa. They were correct on both fronts. But they also concluded that there must be an unknown continent in the south, a missing continent whose size was on par with massive Eurasia. Their reasoning was that there must be an equal amount of land in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere to keep this round ball in balance. Well, that's wrong. We know today that around 72% of the world's surface is in the northern hemisphere. In the mid-300s BC, Aristotle himself spoke for the then orthodox view.
There must be a land bearing the same relation to the southern pole as the place we live in bears to our pole.
And, who can argue with Aristotle? Well, nobody until Captain Cook over 2 millennia later, which we're going to get to. In 146 BC, the Roman Republic was on an expansionist high, crushing Greece once and for all. Many Greeks were marched to the Italian peninsula and forced into slavery, where the Greeks would begin their intellectual conquest of Rome. The Romans had long revered Greek learning, and the best thinkers were well treated by their masters in Italy. Greeks tutored the Romans, who lapped it all up, insisting the entire canon be downloaded. And Rome uncritically embraced the lot, including the rationale for the undiscovered and non-existent megacontinent in the south, which the Romans named Terra Australis incognito, which is Latin for unknown south land. So if it's ever asked,
What have the Romans ever done for us?
Australians at least can answer, well, they came up with a cool name for our country. Despite the leading thinkers of the ancient world agreeing that Terra Australis was absolutely, definitely down there somewhere, no one bothered to sail off and discover it. Rome was a great power for a millennium. They excelled at war, administration, and engineering, but seafaring was not the first love of the Roman landlubbers. Ancient mariners were incapable of navigating for months into empty ocean. That would change in the late Middle Ages, and the impetus to develop those great ships was European trade with Asia. Europe and Asia had been trading goods via land since at least 3000 BC. Complex but somehow efficient networks delivered luxury Asian goods like silk dresses to wealthy Roman women, while Roman coins have been found all across Asia, including the island of Japan. It was these intercontinental trade networks, the fabled Silk Road, which would have informed the Greeks as to just how big Eurasia is. Land-based trade continued to link east and west through the upheavals of the Dark and Middle Ages. In the late 1200s, an Italian, Marco Polo, travelled the Silk Road through Persia and India and then to China. 17-year-old Marco was tagging along with his father and uncle, who, like many others, had done the long but lucrative China trade trip previously. The Chinese/Mongol emperor, Kublai Khan, had met the elder Polos before, and they were warmly welcomed back. So warmly that the emperor convinced Marco, his dad, and his uncle to stay a while. And that turned into 17 years. The three were given senior roles in the bureaucracy. Young Marco must have clearly impressed. Kublai Khan appointed him to something like his Minister for Foreign Affairs. Under the emperor's authority, Marco travelled throughout China, as well as modern-day Japan, Vietnam, Burma, Sri Lanka, and as far south as Indonesia. On his return to Europe, Marco wrote about his time in the Orient. It was a long book, because unfortunately, Marco found himself a jailed prisoner of war, so he had plenty of spare time. Educated Europeans had had some understanding of a great civilization in the Far East. Marco Polo, however, painted a vivid picture. In an era before printing, the book was a sales sensation across Europe, and within Polo's writings was seemingly a reference to a, quote, great south land with endless gold. It was a vague reference, it may not have even been a reference at all, but it was enough to stir the ancient myth of Terra Australis from hibernation. European trade along the Silk Road was severely disrupted 2 centuries after Marco Polo's time with the fall of Christian Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans were now masters of modern-day Turkey and much of the Middle East. They imposed taxes and other barriers upon merchants passing through on the east-west route. Just as European monarchs and merchants were enjoying the intellectual creativity of the Renaissance, they were incentivised to look for an alternative means of trading with Asia. During the Middle Ages, Portugal was an economic and cultural backwater, but Portugal did enjoy a fine Atlantic coastline plus proximity to the African west coast. During the second half of the 1400s, Portugal rapidly emerged as the world HQ of shipping innovation. Now, building a ship with sails that can catch the wind and be propelled in the direction of the wind is one thing. People had done that since prehistory. But to engineer a complex structure of sails that can go forward against the wind was the genius breakthrough of the Portuguese. 1492 is etched in the minds of those with an interest in history as the year Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas. But 4 years earlier, in 1488, Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Diaz sailed down the west coast of Africa and reached the continent's southern tip. He then sailed a little up the east coast of Africa. Diaz wanted to keep going, but his crew, fearful of running out of supplies, insisted on a U-turn. But regardless, Diaz returned home a hero. The Portuguese king christened the southern tip of Africa the Cape of Good Hope, a successful marketing ploy designed to encourage further exploration of a potential bonanza, a sea route to Asia that bypassed the Ottomans. Within a decade, another Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, and he did make it all the way to India and then back to Portugal. Da Gama was disappointed he couldn't buy more goods while in India, but when he returned home, he still made a dazzling profit. Diaz and da Gama triggered the shipping equivalent of a gold rush. The sea route to Asia was now open. The ocean was so much quicker than the old Silk Road, plus it cut out expensive middlemen. Sure, the voyage had its dangers. Shipwrecks, pirates, scurvy, languishing in a tropical jail when a contract dispute ended badly. But regardless, sailing a ship to Asia and back was irresistibly lucrative. An investment in a ship and crew would typically deliver a 400% return. Ships carrying over 1,000 tonnes were soon coming and going, delivering prized goods at either end of the trip. There were almost 1,000 Portugal-Asia return voyages between 1500 and 1629. That's almost one a month. An unknown world was becoming known. As the importer and distributor of exotic goods to Europe, Portugal became fabulously rich. Merchants in other European nations scrambled to catch up. Across the 1500s, the Portuguese established commercial posts in Asia that stretched from modern-day Japan, China, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India. It was awesomely impressive. Australia's near neighbour, the island of Timor, had a Portuguese trading base as early as 1512, only 24 years after Diaz's voyage and almost 3 centuries before Captain Cook sailed into Botany Bay. But despite all of this, Asia was of only secondary interest to the Portuguese. Their real overseas focus was closer to home in modern-day Brazil, in South America, and Angola and Mozambique in Africa. It's passed from popular memory, but Portugal built the world's first global empire. The most common language in the Southern Hemisphere today is still Portuguese. After a stupendously prosperous century, by the early 1600s, Portugal sadly was in decline. As is so often the case, excessive prosperity can induce overconfidence and overspending on wasteful projects like wars and palace renovations. The Dutch Republic used its fast-rising military power to capture and take possession of all Portuguese ports in Asia, bar Timor and Macau. Like the Portuguese, the Dutch also had colonies in the Americas and Africa, but unlike the Portuguese, the Dutch focus was Asia, and in particular the archipelago at the junction of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, what we know today as Indonesia, but which the Dutch referred to at the time officially as the Dutch East Indies, but colloquially as the Spice Islands. Trade with India and elsewhere in Asia was lucrative, but the Spice Islands were next level. Exotic spices became such an irrational craze in Europe that nutmeg, cloves, and saffron were at times literally worth more than their weight in gold. Prices fluctuated, of course, but at one point, nutmeg sold in Amsterdam for 60,000 times the cost of the purchase in the Spice Islands. Spain too had arrived in East Asia soon after the Portuguese. Spain, however, came to their Asian base, the modern-day Philippines, not via the Indian Ocean. Spain came across the Pacific Ocean from New Spain, or what we know today as Mexico and Central America. The Danish, the Norwegians, the British and the French in the 1600s and for most of the 1700s also had a presence in East Asia, but they were minnows. The British and the French at this time were occupied with North America, the Caribbean and India. They would be latecomers to Asia. For many centuries prior to the arrival of any Europeans, Japanese, Indian and Arab merchants had a roaring trade with Southeast Asia. This is why Buddhism and Islam feature prominently in the region today. Chinese merchants had been trading in the region for millennia. This commercial frenzy was on the doorstep of present-day Australia. Many European ships, mostly Dutch, on their way to Southeast Asia, bumped into Australia's western and northern coastlines, but only because they were off course. After not seeing commercial opportunities here, they quickly got back on track and headed north for Asia. It is doubtful it was the first, but the first documented European visit to modern Australia was by Dutchman William Janszoon. Janszoon was the governor in the Dutch East Indies. On his third stint in the East in 1606, he was sent to find trade opportunities in, quote,
the great land of New Guinea and other East and Southlands.
This tells us that as early as 1606 there was some concept of a land to the south. Janszoon sailed along the south coast of New Guinea and approached the narrow strait between that large island and Australia. There were endless reefs and islands and the waters were becoming increasingly shallow. That spelt danger. Janszoon miscalculated that he was about to bump into a wall of land connecting New Guinea to what we know as Cape York Peninsula, the very northern tip of Australia. Janszoon made a map showing that New Guinea and the far north of Australia was a single landmass. This is an understandable error. Even today, many large shipping and military vessels cannot sail through that shallow strait. 6 months later, a Spanish ship captained by Luis Vaz de Torres was on his way from Peru to the modern-day Philippines when he sailed off course, and unlike Janszoon, he did find a way through the strait that today bears his name, the Torres Strait. De Torres had no idea he had come so close to the eastern coastline of New Holland, and he and Spain kept his maps secret from the Dutch. Janszoon's miscalculation prevented the Dutch discovering the fertile eastern coastline of this continent. Janszoon's report of the Gulf of Carpentaria was unflattering. The locals were hostile, the coastline was endless swamp. The more the Dutch saw of modern Australia, the less interest they had in it. In 1644, the Dutch named this continent Nova Hollande, Latin for New Holland. And that at least implies that early on they had some hope of doing something with it, but they never got around to it. It was still believed that Terra Australis was down there somewhere, but these crews had crossed the seas to make money, not sightsee. At this point, finding Terra Australis was not a priority for anyone, bar the intellectuals in Europe. And from what the Dutch had seen of New Holland, it couldn't be Terra Australis because what they have seen of it was simply too barren. Terra Australis's greatest promoter since Aristotle was inadvertently Christopher Columbus. 2 centuries after Marco Polo, Columbus took a punt to find the East by sailing west. He thought he'd found Asia, but others soon followed and sailed up, down and around this new world. Within a few decades, maps confirmed that this was not Asia. This was a whole new landmass stretching from almost the North Pole to almost the South Pole. And wasn't it interesting? There appeared to be a neatly equal amount of land in the northern and southern hemispheres. So, the ancients must have been right. Terra Australis must be down under somewhere, and it must be on par with the size of Eurasia. Terra Australis was now widely accepted as a geographical fact. It was just a question of when it would be found, and who would find and claim it first. So confident were the Europeans that their world maps from the 1500s to the 1800s often included guesses as to the location of Terra Australis. Myths are prone to embellishment, and Terra Australis was soon a land of lush fields and forests, occupied by 50 million, including wealthy merchants eager to trade. It was the settled science of the day. Terra Australis was the last big prize on the world map. The race was on. Geoffrey Blaney writes,
Later generations have forgotten the allure of this missing continent. The intense and widespread search for it and the ardent belief in its existence have been almost erased from learned memory. Terra Australis incognita was viewed as both a colossus and a jewel. It was believed to be the largest piece of unsold real estate in the world. In the imagination of many, it would be as fertile and as productive as the Americas. The speculation was never-ending.
As Europeans became more familiar with Southeast Asia, thoughts turned to actually finding Terra Australis. They'd seen a fair bit of New Holland, but it was too arid, too north and too small. Now, we think of Australia as big, but Eurasia is about 6 times larger, and Terra Australis was, of course, of equal size to Eurasia. New Holland could have, however, been a northern part of Terra Australis. In the first half of the 1600s, the Dutch took the lead. From their base in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, dozens of voyages set out. These were primarily commercial voyages looking for trading opportunities, but none were found, and with time the Dutch suspicion that all of New Holland was worthless was accepted. Along the way, the Dutch crudely mapped the northern, western and southwestern coastlines of New Holland, but were disinterested in the eastern half of this landmass because, of course, Terra Australis was much further south, and it was assumed eastern New Holland would be just as desolate as the rest. It was a false assumption, but a false assumption that shielded eastern New Holland from European exploration for a century and a half. In 1642, the Dutch East India Company financed Abel Tasman's first voyage. This time it was not about trade. Tasman's purpose was to find Terra Australis. Tasman and his fleet of 3 ships sailed from Batavia all the way over to Mauritius, off the east coast of Africa, and then deep down into the cold, wild South Ocean. No land was found, but when they hit ice, Tasman headed due east. With the roaring 40s at his back, Tasman travelled fast and far, but found no land, until they bumped into an island that today bears his name, Tasmania, but which he named Van Diemen's Land, which I've always thought was a poor choice of name when pronounced in English. Van Diemen's Land. Van Diemen's Land was on first appearances a promising candidate for Terra Australis. It was clearly more fertile than New Holland. Tasman and his crew followed its coastline south because, of course, that's where Terra Australis was, but the western coast soon disappointingly stopped and rounded into an eastern coast. Tasman followed the east coast up, but as he went north, he sensed a rough strait ahead and correctly calculated he had an island, not a missing continent. Before departing, Tasman planted the Dutch flag on land, claimed it for his republic, and resumed his voyage east. Days later, Abel Tasman was the first European to see what he was likely responsible for naming, New Zealand, in honour of a scenic coastal region in his homeland. Tasman had arrived midway up the west coast of the South Island and headed north. When he came to the strait between the North and South Islands of New Zealand, he assumed it was merely a bay, but Tasman is vague and his vagueness adds to the mystery. A single landmass was further proof he had found Terra Australis. 2 big islands, however, would diminish those chances. Tasman then sailed to the northern tip of the North Island. All the way, for 3 weeks, this land of New Zealand was gloriously lush. Tasman had seen enough. He wrote in his journal,
"We believe that this is the mainland coast of the unknown Southland."
Tasman was pretty sure, and for more than a century Europe was too, that New Zealand was Terra Australis, and therefore that it stretched almost all the way to South America. Confident he had fulfilled his mission and made history on par with Columbus, Tasman decided to head back to his base in Batavia so he could tell everyone. Now, he could have sailed home by backtracking via Van Diemen's Land, or he could have sailed northwest to see what was on the east coast of New Holland. But he didn't, and instead he sailed directly north. Tasman is the first reported European to sight Tonga and Fiji, but then he went up and around the north of New Guinea and back to Batavia. The next year, Tasman set off again. This time his mission was to return to the South Pacific to ascertain the extent of New Zealand, and hopefully to confirm it was Terra Australis. From Batavia, Tasman followed the south coast of New Guinea, but repeating Jan Zoon's error a generation earlier, he misjudged the shallow Torres Strait and drew a map connecting New Guinea and Cape York Peninsula. Tasman then mapped the western coast of the Gulf of Carpentaria and the northern coastline of New Holland before returning to Batavia. Twice in 2 years, Tasman had been unlucky to miss New Holland's 4,000-kilometre fertile east and southeast coastline. For centuries, the Spanish had sent countless trading ships back and forth across the Pacific between the Americas and the Philippines. Their cargo was mostly silver that would be sold on to China. There is no confirmed record of any of these Manila galleons being blown off course and landing on a beach in North Queensland, but that actually may have happened in 1574. But it wasn't just the Portuguese, the Dutch and the Spanish who missed our east coast. Asia had ignored the continent for forever. The Chinese had invented the compass 2,000 years earlier and had at various times sent trading fleets into the Indian Ocean and likely all the way to Africa. There is, however, no hint they visited Australia beyond limited trade with the Aboriginals of today's Northern Territory. It's also odd that the Polynesians made no impression on Australia. They had been sailing all around the Pacific for perhaps 5 millennia, and in the process had settled over 1,000 islands as remote as New Zealand, Easter Island and Hawaii. Surely some had landed on Australia's huge east coast, but the DNA is clear. They didn't stay. Perhaps they were shooed away by the first Australians, or they didn't get the subtleties of bush tucker and departed hungry. Abel Tasman got close, but the Dutch golden era of exploration was winding down after his efforts. The east coast of New Holland, or what Geoffrey Blaney calls the hidden face of Australia, would remain unknown to the outside world for another 130 years. Join us next time as we arrive in the 1760s and the British are coming, but so are the French.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.